So as promised, we're beginning a sermon series on the Gospel of Luke today. We'll be working our way through the Gospel for 6 weeks total. I hope that you will join in reading the Gospel at home. It's 4 chapters a week, about 20 minutes of reading, maybe 30 if you want to really pour over it. And while our sermons will focus on the reading that is done in worship each week, it might draw from that larger text as well. So I'm hoping you'll read through that with us. We're beginning with Jesus' public ministry. The story, Luke has some infancy narratives, and then Jesus' baptism and temptation, and then this reading from today. Functionally, it's the first sermon he preaches in his ministry. And I think it's worth noting, he almost gets thrown off a cliff. So, hold that idea. And I want you to remember 2 more stories. First of all, one of them comes from a show I have been rewatching in pandemic, Designing Women. So Designing Women was a sitcom from the 80s. It was deeply formative for me. I think it's still amazing. We can talk about that in another setting if you disagree, but trust me, I am right. The premise is that there are a group of 4 women who own a design firm, an interior design firm. They were known for tackling political issues of their days in a variety of ways. I would probably not be standing here if not for that show. But like many shows, they do have one stock male character. His name is Anthony Bouvier. He's a young black man in his 20s who they've hired to make deliveries. Over time, he becomes more and more of a prominent character in the show. Throughout the show, they make references to Anthony's unfortunate incarceration. He regales these women with stories of T. Tommy Reeves, the meanest dude on his cell block. T. Tommy also thought manners were important. So Anthony has some very precise knowledge of table settings and how to serve people because of T. Tommy Reeves. Well into the show that lasted for several seasons, there's someone who visits the women. And they ask, do you know what Anthony did? Do you know the story of his unfortunate incarceration? They said, well, no, we just assumed he did whatever he did. They said he did, and we wanted to give him a second chance. Well, it turns out when they find out the story that Anthony was 17 at the time of his unfortunate incarceration. He had gone with friends to get beer. He wasn't old enough to go in the store, so he waited in the car ready to drive after they came out with their purchases. He was signing up for some underage drinking, nothing else. What he didn't know is that while his friends were inside, they demanded the contents of the cash register. He unknowingly drove the getaway car for a robbery, was tried as an adult, and then was incarcerated. We don't know how long his incarceration lasts, but we know that it was formative and was at least several years, so that he's in his 20s by the time he's working for the Sugar Baker design firm. So that's story number 2 for you to hold. And here is story number 3. If this were a normal year, and God knows nothing is normal, then sometime last month we would have held a school supply drive. Some of you I know are still even waiting for school supply lists from your schools indicating how very not normal this year is. So one of the things when we do most any drive, but school drive in particular, is we always include a low-cost item. If it's a school supply drive, that's often crayons, maybe erasers, maybe note cards. It kind of depends on what the agency we're working with has asked for, but crayons you can get for 50 cents this time of year, typically on our list. We have that variety of possibilities, hoping and trusting that then participation becomes affordable for most people and therefore possible for most people, including children. It comes out of the conviction that there is no one who should be excluded from full participation in religious community, especially because of income. Now, there is a biblical precedent for this idea. It's actually how we know that Jesus' family, and likely Jesus himself, was poor. In Leviticus 12, there's outlined the purification ritual for after childbirth. And so, people are asked to bring to the temple a 1-year-old sheep and a pigeon or a dove to sacrifice for purification. But if you cannot afford a sheep, then you can bring 2 pigeons or doves, which is exactly what Jesus' family has done earlier in Luke's gospel. That cheaper option, that preferential option for the poor that they are able to afford. So we know Luke's gospel tells the story of an upside down reign of God. This is not how we expect things to be, but right at the beginning of his public ministry, Jesus takes special effort to read from the scroll of Isaiah so that we know exactly how shocking this upside down is going to be. He reads, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me. He has sent me to preach good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the prisoners and recovery of sight to the blind, to liberate the oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Now, as I'm reading this and thinking about it, I am actually struck by how little Jesus says about the poor, or the prisoners, or the blind, or the oppressed. There's no information. There's no qualifiers about, well, if they do this. There's no naming of exactly why they are poor, or blind, or oppressed, or in prison. It is this bare bones iteration. I am here for them. I am here for the poor and the prisoners and the blind and the oppressed. And we get a lot of expansion upon that through the Gospels, but that remains the first and final word of what Jesus' ministry is about. We do have other stories in the Gospel where people assume that something is wrong with this person. There's a story of a man born blind, and in many ways it echoes our modern experience, because as people come around, they say, well, what did he do? Did he sin? Did his parents? We don't ever find the answer to that question. Jesus heals him. Because that's not what Jesus is worried about. Jesus says clearly, I have come to give sight. I've come to give sight to this person who is blind. And so we have the story of Jesus that I think we know, but it's worth naming. Jesus doesn't say anything about moral failings. Jesus isn't worried if the person's state that needs help is their fault. Jesus is instead worried about their liberation from that state. Now, I think as we go through that list, some of Jesus' words make more sense than others. They're easier to stomach. We understand blindness as a physical illness. We talk about healing regularly. That one's pretty easy to get on board with, maybe. I know often we talk about disabilities in our community, and the problem is the lack of accommodations often, not the disability. But I still think there's an understanding there, something that we say, oh, well, yeah, this is good, even if there are people who might want to challenge that in our own world. I think for most of us, when Jesus says that I have come to preach good news to the poor, we understand that poor means people who don't have enough money. We understand that if you don't make enough money, there's no way to manage your way out of poverty. And when we go back to that story of giving school supplies to families who can't purchase them on their own, we also are pointing our way to something hopeful, both that we're part of the community and these children are ours too, but also that being in school might offer them a different reality in the future. So now let's go one story back more. This time to that story of Anthony Bouvier and prisoners. And I realized when I was reading that text, I am used to a different translation that says captives. And I react differently to prisoners. I assume incarcerated people did something wrong. And that rewriting of the text to be captives rather than prisoners, it's especially problematic because Jesus quoted from a much older text, Isaiah. And sometimes we want to say captives so we can interpret it as metaphor. Sometimes we want it to be religious prisoners, which was experienced by the early church. The truth is, with Isaiah, with Jesus, there's not really a reason to think there's much nuance to prison or prisoners, for that matter. I think instead, what we really want to talk about when we talk about those prisoners, biblically, is an unjust empire. They're oppressing people. They are taking over lands. But I also have to wonder about the justice of the empire that we live in, especially when we start talking about prisoners. I want to offer just a very small glimpse into our prison problem in the United States. And when I say glimpse, I mean glimpse. Very, very small glimpse. We have one of the highest incarceration rates in the world in the United States. We have especially seen the realities of our crowded prison during the COVID-19 pandemic. Prisoners who were eligible for parole got their dates bumped up as we tried to empty prisons or at least make social distancing possible. Still, the prisons are struggling to contain the virus both within their populations and within their staff. Their own death tolls are rising. And it becomes especially apparent during this season. We are aware right now that California is in its annual wildfire season. It is scary and leads to evacuations across the state. Just a few days ago, our own power service had the possibility of being interrupted because of those fires. Now, what is also happening this year is that there aren't as many people available to fight the fires. Many of the crews working on those fires in any given year are prison crews. This year they have roughly half as many inmate crews available for fighting those fires. For that dangerous work, those prisoners get paid $2 to $5 a day and $1 an hour more when they are fighting. If we talk about injustices, we need to talk about wages that are essentially slave wages. And so our prisoners become free labor or near free labor for companies. In this scenario, in California, we also now are facing the realities of that choice. When something happens to destabilize our prisons, more lives become endangered. And maybe out of all of those injustices, it is most important to note that when prisoners are released, they generally cannot be employed as firefighters because they were incarcerated. We have the system of mass incarceration now. In the 1970s, there was actually widespread hope that prisons would close because we were doing so much better in so many areas. But in the early 80s, drug policies changed, including the wars on drugs. And so our incarceration rate dramatically increased to reach that same incarceration rate of 50 years ago. And rate, not numbers. Our population has increased. We're talking about rate. We would need to release 4 out of every 5 prisoners in the United States. From 1982 to 2006, our nationwide incarceration expenditures tripled. And this industry is now deeply embedded in our economy, especially in Arizona. If you want to read more about it, I highly recommend the new Jim Crow, but there are many, many resources. And the truth about prison is that prison makes more prisoners. Someone who has a family member who's incarcerated, especially if that person is a child, is more likely to end up in prison. That is the tiny, tiny tip of the iceberg. But it matters when Jesus has on his list of people prisoners who need good news, who need to hear something, who need even release proclaimed. And now let's go back to that first story when Jesus' original audience tries to run Jesus off a cliff. We know that Jesus generally upends our expectations. And I think his original audience was most upset for the same reasons we might be. Good news that doesn't benefit us. It might be amazing news for someone else, but it feels not great for us. And I think we lump ourselves in with Jesus' audience because those were good church folks who were sitting there listening to Jesus, and they were scandalized. I think when they realize we're talking not just about us, but about them. And the poor people who are unpleasant, who smell, the prisoners who keep throwing away their chances, the oppressed that give us a reason to feel good about ourselves because they're worse off than we are. All of that, they realize we're not them. I think that's part of it. I think it's also very hard to see good news expand, especially if you want to keep it for yourself. But the truth is, if we call ourselves disciples of Jesus, then we are allies with the poor. We are allies with the prisoners. We are allies with the blind. We are allies with the oppressed. And we are that first and foremost. We must remember that this election season. Amen.